Well, good afternoon, good night, good evening, good morning, wherever you are across somewhere in our lovely world. Thanks so much for joining us here live on the one and only Serverless Office Hours. This is a panel for you in front of you, can you imagine? Normally it's only myself with one other lucky guest, but we've got many people to talk all about cool things. We are talking about the 10 years of ECS and Lambda birthdays which are coming up. ECS is already 10 years old. I'm told I'm slightly in trouble because actually Lambda officially turns 10 years tomorrow from the announcement. But as somebody did say, well, Lambda already existed 10 years ago. So we may be a day early, but I think everyone will forgive us as well. Yeah, so thanks so much for joining us. We are live on Office Hours, so we'd love to hear from you. We always love to hear where our lovely people from all across the world. So yeah, send us a message in whatever channels. We are live on the AWS Twitch channel, on the YouTube Serverless Land, and also via LinkedIn Live. So any of those channels, we'd love to hear from you. What you've been building with ECS, what you've been building with Lambda, and we've got a great panel of experts we're going to be chatting to hear about all the other kind of things. So let's remind ourselves, why not? If we cast back our mind to sort of 10 years ago, let's remind ourselves a little about what happened when ECS.
Are you guys ready? But why do we love development containers? Yeah, it's easier to manage development. Portability between environments makes it much easier. There's much lower risk in deployments. Easier to manage and maintain application components and have them work together. But it's really hard, I find. Yeah? Scheduling containers requires a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah? You have to work on optimizing placement for utilization, placement for high availability, the right resources per container, launching them, rolling them back, managing the cluster management, all these kind of things. It makes it really hard. It's not simple. And so, what if you could get all the benefits of containers without the overhead? Introducing the Amazon EC2 container service. A highly scalable, high-performance container management service. Yeah, you can manage containers at any scale. You can launch them, you can terminate them to clusters of EC2 instances. You can run tens of thousands of containers with built-in versioning for deployment and rollback. Yes, we all win. Because, it's free. Yeah? Or, you still have to pay for EC2 resources, of course, that you're using. But the service by itself is free of charge. Oh.
Well, that's a good sort of blast from the past. I love the sort of montage of all the different kind of things that were coming out. And in fact, I love also that Werner ended with "it's free." It's actually strange to think that AWS comes out with such a big product that does a huge amount of things and it's free. Jeff, if I can sort of throw it over to you, what do you remember of those kind of days, and what was going on in AWS at the time?
Okay, so 10 years ago was like a lot of launches happened a decade ago. We didn't really have that word serverless to start with, and it's always interesting to define something by what isn't there, right? Like the fact that it isn't something makes it better, which is kind of a unique kind of linguistic construct, I guess. But both ECS and Lambda, what I remember about both of those is launching those, and people took to them right away. Sometimes there's a bit of a hesitancy with something new where there's a bit of a toe in the water, and it's like either what is this, or does this meet my needs, or is it gonna work for me? But both ECS and Lambda, people looked at and said, "Yep, I'll take 20 to go, please, and let's just do it and make it happen." And looking back, what I find now, so now these are taken as fundamental building blocks, and now we're at this really opposite situation where I've had more than one person in the last 2 years. I use the word data center, and you suddenly hear this like, what's this old guy talking about? What is that? And so
It's like cassette tapes.
Yeah, exactly. We've redefined the industry in a really powerful way that is for our customers' benefit.
Excellent. I mean, Malcolm, you work obviously hugely, or have worked hugely on the sort of whole container ecosystem and with ECS. I mean, you have been at AWS a long time, and I believe you were actually working in my home city, the best of the world, Cape Town at that time, but on the EC2 team. So, what was happening around when ECS was coming out, and how did you think of this as an EC2 person with the new things of containers?
So yeah, I had the privilege of being in AWS for the last 14 years. A chunk of that was in Cape Town. Super excited, super interesting. I remember, I was focused on EC2 development at the time. I remember Deepak and the team announcing a need for engineers. They're gonna launch this new service. Super interesting, super exciting tech. A lot of engineers kind of looking to get that opportunity to kind of get in there early. I was a little later to the game. I only joined the team 6 years ago, so I was a little slower to start, but managed to get in there just as we were launching Fargate. But really such a big hype from the team around, an opportunity to kind of build this technology for our customers.
Cool. In fact, I actually spoke to Deepak before, and Deepak Singh was one of the founders of ECS, and unfortunately he would have loved to have joined, but he said he couldn't. And he said actually their first sprint was on July the 7th, 2014. So that's only 6 months before. There were 5 of us. We launched in preview without a scheduler. When it became clear that our customers wanted one of their engineers wrote up one in under a week. So that was pretty scrappy of putting these things, these things together. Nick, thanks so much for joining us as well. Nick is sort of in charge of sort of all of our product across our serverless compute, and also some of our cool science stuff as well. So, Nick, like 10 years for Lambda and ECS, in your mind, how do you think about that? What does it mean over 10 years, and what has it meant for customers in AWS?
I mean, it's been fascinating to see that journey, because I've been at AWS for 6 years, but I was a container user for all of those 10 years. And to see it go from, this shiny new thing of like, ooh, there's this containers thing and there's this functions thing, and maybe we should try that out, to now today, it is kind of the de facto way that you build new software. And the transformation that's happened over that time, and to be a part of that and to see all of the things that the customers have done and asked us for and that we've delivered on has been a super interesting journey. I mean, there's not many times that you see that level of transformation happen in an industry, right? Where something goes from the new thing that maybe we should try to it's now the way that everyone runs software. It's just a really interesting transformation to see and be a part of.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We look now and we think of serverless being everywhere, and serverless being a lot of sort of different places. But I mean, 10 years ago, as as you said, that didn't exist. And I think even the cloud was really early 2014. We sort of take it for granted now. But I mean, these were, and even containers, I think in 2014 was those were really early days for containers. I remember, I think my sort of first experience with a container was much later on in sort of the 2014, 2015, 2016 time. I actually came to DockerCon in Seattle. It was the first time I'd been there. So yeah, these were early kind of days of building these kind of primitives. So Nick, from that sort of perspective, you talk about it being a fundamental part of AWS, but in terms of a broader industry, what does serverless mean? And not just compute, but in terms of the other services we have.
Yeah, serverless, I think, in a lot of ways, serverless is just a natural evolution of what started when the cloud first was introduced, right? This idea that you go from saying, if I want to, back in 2000, if you wanted to offer a software product, there was a whole bunch of stuff that you had to do, right? You had to racks and switches and routers and power supplies, and then you get the operating system, and then the software running on that operating system, and it was complicated. And then, we introduced the concept of cloud, and suddenly there was a bunch of things you didn't have to do. And serverless is kind of a natural extension of that, to say, well, actually, there's even more things that you don't have to do. It's not just the hardware and the switches and the routers and the racks, but the operating system. You don't have to be in charge of patching an operating system and picking which operating system you're going to run and making sure that you've got the right kernel drivers and network configurations, right? Serverless even takes that to the next level and just says there's even more things that you don't have to do. And that, that journey that we're on with serverless is not over by any means. I would say it still feels to me like still at the beginning in terms of when we look at well, what else can we take off of your plate so that you don't have to think about that, so that you can focus on the thing that really matters for your business and don't spend time on infrastructure level code. Don't spend time on sort of undifferentiated heavy lifting code that doesn't really add value to your business. And serverless is all about that idea of just expanding the things that we can manage for you so that you can focus on what matters, which is the cloud value proposition of the cloud too.
Yeah, I think they're very much tied together. Eric, when did sort of serverless come on your radar, and like, how do you remember that happening?
So for me, it was back when they announced Lambda functions, and I say Lambda functions because I fear Chris Munn's. But when they invented Lambdas, right? So I'm gonna say it. I threw it out there. I remember being, I wasn't quite. I didn't work for AWS at the time. I worked for a partner, but I remember them announcing Lambda functions, and I hadn't really learned of any of the other services, right? And to me, I watched the presentation and went, oh my gosh, why would you do it any other way? And then for the partner I was working for, every time we would come in, we have customers sit down with us. We were doing large, solution architect, jobs with them. And I would sit there and go, this would be easy if you just did it on serverless. And so we ended up, I became the serverless guy at the partner, and they would say, okay, they want to do serverless, we bring them in. And so I just lived and eaten and breathed it before I even came to it. So that was my start of it.
Cool. No, love it. Well, why don't we switch focus slightly to the other sort of brother in the kinship? And maybe they were twins. Seeing ECS and Lambda were literally in the same keynote. I think Werner's keynote was about an hour and a half. And I think it was a good 20-25 minutes on a Lambda and a good 20-25 minutes or something like that on ECS. So it's, a good more than half of Werner's keynote was just focused to these services, which is really interesting. But let's see what he had to say about Lambda.
I want to introduce to you something that's very exciting. It is AWS Lambda, which is an event-driven compute service for dynamic applications. You can reduce your development effort by writing no more glue code. You can respond to new and updated data quickly. You can make extending applications by writing new code without actually having to change the old code. You can improve performance through concurrency. And you have to run no servers, no instances, nothing. You just write a code and it will run for you. And so the focus here is on events. And so these events may be driven by, for example, AWS services that will trigger these events. That could be, for example, an S3 upload notification or a DynamoDB stream update, but we'll get to there in a minute. And you'll write some code. In this case, we were starting off. We'll just provide JavaScript, but you will be able to write other code later on as well. And most importantly, as this will run for you automatically, without any compute infrastructure that you have to provision for it. This is easy to use, low maintenance. You can run code without managing infrastructure. Let me repeat that. You can write code without having to manage any infrastructure. The cloud functions you write are in JavaScript, and Lambda will take care of managing, scaling, monitoring, and logging for you. It will respond very fast to events. Execution of such a function is in milliseconds after that the event is being triggered. Each event is then processed through that status cloud function that you've written, and thousands of functions can run in parallel. And this is great because your code will only run when needed. For example, if you have a mobile device that will send an update to S3 that will then be triggered a cloud function, only then the function will run. You won't have to have this running all the time. It will be very low fee per request, cost effective at high rates, low rates, and you can run it once a month, or maybe you can run thousands of these functions a second.
That's fantastic. It's interesting to see 10 years later that actually not that much has changed. So over to you, Ajay. Ajay, you quite literally can be called one of the fathers of Lambda. So, what was going on at that time, and what was the genesis of Lambda?
Well, at that specific moment, the announcement of Julian, it was just panic in the backstage because we were all
Sure.
waiting with bated breath to see what the announcement reaction would be. I think as Nick said, I think Lambda and ECS both showed up at a particular time where the industry was moving, where cloud was new, the idea of using services as the component for building applications was just getting started. And I think both ECS and Lambda came from that same idea about saying, how can we make this model of application development faster, easier, simpler, and just take things off people's plate? Lambda kind of started at the top and went the way down, said, look, the easiest way to build applications is to compose services together. Like, why even bother writing whatever code you write a little bit of application and let the rest be handled by AWS. We picked sort of event-driven applications as the showcase scenario. I remember a little bit of history. It was originally called S3 Compute because the whole idea was to try to adjust with S3 and do events with it. And then, Lambda became the code name, and then eventually ended up launching as that event-driven service when we got out. And there were a lot of hot and fast launches coming in there as well. You talked about orchestrators being written in a week. We put together the pollers for Kinesis and Dynamo in a week and a half before launch to kind of get those things out there. So the services were built together at serverless speed, so to speak, at that particular point of launch. But the genesis came from the same place, which is what's the shortest path to value for customers to build an application out there and get code up and running. And as you can see, as the serverless ecosystem has evolved, that concept of application primitives as services continue to hold, right? Like you build workflows, you build NBDB, became sort of the primitive over there. Event Bridge, all of them built on that same concept of saying, how do you put an application together with business logic in production grade with AWS's operation experience, or the provider's operation experience really backing that up. And I think it's been fascinating to see how the two services evolve. I still remember, by the way, Werner has a tweet on November 15, 2014. I think it's still up. It says, most heard comment at reInvent is AWS Lambda is the coolest ever. So I think that's still up there. And a showcase tweet if that captures the sentiment of what was happening at reInvent.
Excellent. So you did mention, one of the genesis being S3 notifications, very common pattern we think of now for doing file processing. And I sort of heard that somebody came up with the idea that they wanted to do this S3 thing. How did that evolve into, well, okay, S3 is just one use case, but we can actually build this event-driven model for a lot of use cases. And then to actually launch with not just S3, but also DynamoDB and Kinesis streams, I mean, there sort of is a bit of a jump of, you think of AWS as a big place, lots of different services. How did the sort of coordination happen to think we're not just going to build something for S3, but we're going to build a ubiquitous thing?
Yeah, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, Julian. That's how it happened. But look, I think this is, again, one of those, it sounds very strategic and top-down, but it was just good old-fashioned customer feedback. There were 3 different parts of the company, S3, DynamoDB, and at that time, a service that was coming out for building mobile backend applications, all of which were looking at this idea of running arbitrary code in response to some kind of user action that need to be taken, whether it's a mobile request or an event or DynamoDB. And the AWS leaders at that time, Tim Wagner, looked around and said, "Hey, hold on! All 3 of us seem to be trying to say the same thing. Why don't we just put our forces together and see if we can solve this in one clean way more than anything else?" So, fun fact: the mobile backend service that eventually got merged into Lambda, the other part of it went on to eventually be launched as API Gateway. That was sort of the front door for building in requests and sort of coming in there as well. But again, it was driven just by customer feedback. You had 3 different folks asking for the same different problem, and AWS's sort of leap of innovation there was looking across the 3 and saying, hey, this is actually all the same thing, which is the ability for you to run arbitrary code without having to manage the underlying infrastructure in an operational manner that the best of breed services run and operate at that particular time. And I think that core belief has carried forward into a whole bunch of other serverless behaved services that have come since. Like, I would say we have drifted, the idea of everything being a service and event-driven and others have all sort of farmed off and become different routes in the entire history. But that core idea that run a whole bunch of complex software without having to run the underlying infrastructure has evolved. And that's where I think the newer generation of serverless services, the Auroras or even Elastic's own serverless service, all of them sort of plug into that same model of being able to make those work.
Cool.
So I have a question for you,
Eric.
Ajay, and you and I know we've talked about this a bit, but did you foresee? And I'm always, people ask me, are you against Lambda? And obviously I'm not, but I always talk about chaining services, using the services. Lambda is an absolute last kind of. Especially for my code, Lambda should be your last choice, right? But did you foresee this kind of, and I think I don't know if you coined it, but this serviceful idea when y'all were building it?
No, it's a great question. I think we saw this emergent pattern of event-driven applications being a thing. So I think one of the big bets, I would say just philosophically, Lambda was a big portion. Jeff, you will remember this at that time, to say getting back to AWS's developer roots, so to speak, right? There was a big push in saying that that's where AWS is great at, it continues to be good at, and really recognizing what are the leading edge patterns that we can go and pick off of. So Lambda launching with Node, Lambda going big on event-driven patterns. The whole idea was saying, we're going to lead the way applications need to be built. And this is how it would be if we were building this ground up. It's not just wrapping a platform on top of a set of managed services. It's truly embracing that core concept of building cloud native applications and putting them together. Event-driven first, serviceful first. Everything is in HTTP API. Everything is in well-defined event. Everything is going through an authentication. Everything is secured through IAM, and building that forward. So the hope was that the pattern that was being put out there would be the pattern that becomes the default for many applications to be built moving forward. And I think history has shown that that remains the case. Right now, what's also been interesting is helping other people go through the journey of embracing and adopting that pattern as life goes on too, right? And that's been different. And I think building those bridges, and I think between ECS and Lambda, those bridges have been built in different ways to helping people get to that end state is sort of where the time has been spent really with the last 10 years. I remember one of our early teams having a diagram of the Nirvana floating baby from the Nirvana covers. All the gray hairs in the room should remember, even the no hairs, Eric. So
thank you.
We'll remember the Nirvana cover, and that's how it used to be described, saying that serverless serviceful development with Lambda and ECS and others, the idea is that that's the ideal way for you to just build on the cloud. If you're writing code, write it that way. Best thing, of course, is to write no code, but if you do it, write it the serverless way.
Yeah. So as a follow-up question on that, and this actually isn't from me, this comes from the audience, said, is AWS Lambda inspired by Lambda functions in programming? Any design reasons behind the name? And maybe, we have I'm not calling you old because I think I'm older than both of you, or at least one of you, but our older, our long-lasting folks, do you have any idea behind that?
I would say the idea behind the name sort of came from the idea of Lambda's function signature, or function signature most resembling the idea from functional programming, right? So the whole kind of pipes and otherwise. So, but it was originally called more it was more an internal code name than anything else at that particular time. The other one was Dragonfly, but I don't think it would have translated well into an external service name at that particular time. But no, Lambda was ironically an internal container orchestration conference where both ECS and Lambda were being discussed, and it was actually, I don't remember the gentleman's name. It was a PE over in the retail side of the business who came up with that code name, and then that just stuck. I remember actually Jeff saying, "Don't change this name. This is what it should be."
Yeah, you're right, and I've had a lot of very strong opinions on our proposed and final service names over the years, and we've had a lot of awesome ones. We've had a few that weren't as great, but this was one that was clearly the right name right away.
Yeah, and it wasn't even sort of simple function service or something, which could have been the genesis. So well done, Jeff and Ajay, for knocking that down.
Yeah.
Usman, you sort of now the boss of Lambda now. So 10 years of Lambda, what do you remember? I mean, you've run a whole bunch of services at AWS, previous ones. What even brought you to Lambda? Yeah, why did you want to join Lambda?
So actually, the funny thing is that I used to own a little service called EC2 Autoscaling. I used to run that. And Lambda, the original Lambda at least, used to launch a lot of EC2 instances. We've talked about it since we moved and adopted Firecracker publicly. But this is the pre-Firecracker days. And I owned a little service called Application Autoscaling as well. And we launched autoscaling for ECS containers in 2015, a few months after ECS is launched too. So I was very plugged into the pre-world. And so, I mean, when I think about the genesis of applications, when I joined AWS in 2013, the cool way of building application was to bake an army and deploy it on EC2 instances and auto scale those EC2 instances. So 2014 was a transformational year where suddenly, we went from like the BlackBerry to the iPhones of compute suddenly, where, all these services and the service orchestrators were built on top of auto scaling. So super exciting time. I still remember trying to keep up with the scale of these services, how quickly they were growing, and making sure auto scaling was there to support them. It's been wonderful. After auto scaling, I was basically the general manager for Step Functions, and I launched EventBridge in 2019 as well, which are sister services. And then so many things with Lambda are done today. Our event-driven architectures or orchestrated architectures are built with Step Functions, Lambda, EventBridge together. Peanut butter and jelly for our American friends here. I don't know the right example for the non-American one. And so I've been within the serverless world since 2019, and so it's been pretty exciting for the last year or so to step into Ajay's old shoes. Although they only fit Ajay. I have my own. And so it's been exciting, and we're as Nick alluded to earlier, we're just getting started. There's so much to do here, so much more simplification, so many more cool things we can build in the product. So I'm still excited. It still very much feels like a very early startup to me. Although we've already had created a transformation in the whole world because of the software we build and operate.
Hey, Usman, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. What do you think is the most important thing we're doing right now in the modern times of AWS Lambda? And I'm not asking you to expose roadmap or anything like that, but what do you think? Tell us one thing that we shouldn't tell anybody. No, what do you think? What do you think is just the high or important thing we should be working on?
I would share our top two priorities. Look, our number one priority continues to be security and availability. And then when recently I was in one of the teams in Dublin. Lambda has a large presence in Dublin, Ireland, where we're the systems that do all this automatic patching and security work on your functions. And it just occurred to me that I own the world's largest release management system. Like, we literally patch millions of applications all over the planet at the same time, gradually.
That's a flex right there.
This is a very serious responsibility. We keep so many businesses, so many other people's applications up and running. There's nothing quite like that. So, that security aspect, the availability, the scale, the performance aspect continues to be our number one priority, continues to drive our roadmap and our investments. I think the second thing that I would share, and this maybe be a bit of a roadmap reveal, but you can also see my recent tweets and what Lambda has been launching in the last few weeks. If you look at the work that we've done with Visual Studio Code and putting Visual Studio Code in the console, putting our AWS developer toolkit to enable local and remote debugging, we're still very much about developer experience. We're still very much about leaving a smile on a developer the first time they built a Lambda function and tried the code and got that experience. So we still have a long way to go. And look, 10 years is a long time. We've had other incumbents there, other companies who are offering challenging, compelling developer experiences. That still remains our focus today as a team, as a business, and we're still going and capturing that, and that remains our number one priority, or number two priority after availability, scale, and security.
Cool. No, love the focus. And in a weird way, when you were talking about 10 years ago, the sort of refocus on developers, 10 years later, there's also we've had to build out a lot of primitives for lots of people, but also a bit more of a focus on developers as well. Yannick, I'd love to talk to you as well, because you sort of lead a team of PMs. There are a whole bunch of product managers. People externally may not realize that, Lambda isn't just one thing. It's actually a whole bunch of different sort of moving parts. So, you leading the PMs who designing a pretty impactful service. How do you think about all the different parts that make up Lambda and how it all fits together?
I think taking a step back, we try to understand the developer's journey. And it's a hard job, to build something that other users love is hard. And to take an idea, bring it to life, from concept to production ready application, you need help. There's scaling, patching, security, new programming models, new programming languages that need to evolve. Your team size changes, the organizational factors, operational factors all come into play. So we deeply understand that. We understand that the journey is hard, and the focus continues to be to take all of that heavy lifting away. and increasingly take all of that heavy lifting away. So, the focus, as Usman says, it's going to continue to be developer experience. It's going to continue to improve our scale. We have 1.5 million customers that use the service. We process something like tens of trillions of requests in a month. Now that is not nothing, and that keeps on increasing. So the focus on performance and scale, it just needs to continue to be there. And then the seamless developer experience or the integrations is what allows us to be the face of AWS. Our mission is to make sure that we represent the best of AWS to our external customers. And that means tighter integration with all of the other services and all of the innovation that our peers are driving across the organization. So developer experience, continue to innovate on scale, performance, understand the developer's journey, and make sure we tightly integrate. And at times, we have to be the annoying teammate too. All of us have those. I annoy Usman annoys me, and so on. But think about it. Like when we know or when we feel that taking a decision here is going to backfire on the developer, we try to impose limits there. It might be a soft limit that requires the customer to take some additional steps. It might be a hard limit. We just are against that pattern, at least yet. So we at times are annoying teammate, but most of the times, we get out of their way, give them the right tools to make sure they're able to leverage all of the best technologies and innovation that AWS has to offer.
Cool.
If it makes you feel better, Julian and I annoy Usman as well. So we come in and we love to push back, and he loves it.
I feel like I'm a genesis of all annoyance. All spokes.
Usman is the annoyance funnel.
I'm blown away by that tens of trillions number, and just trying to fit it into my brain is really hard. But when I think about how you build systems for scale and reliability, if you have something that is a 1 in a billion issue or event, that's like 10,000 times a month at tens of trillions of events. So it really just kind of shows you at that scale what it means to be like to do it right.
Yeah, no, those numbers are impactful. When you do sort of average them out over a day or month, you just realize how many things that are going on. And it sort of that does lead into Phil, because I mean, Phil, you're one of the engineers who are literally building Lambda behind behind the scenes. For you, what's the sort of most interesting part that makes up Lambda behind the scenes? And maybe nobody's external has ever heard of it, but what's the sort of cool things you get to work on that makes Lambda tick?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I guess one of the big things, definitely tying into kind of the other topics that we're talking about, like that kind of dynamic range of what kind of workloads customers bring to the service, right? Like somebody could be running at 1 million TPS, somebody could be running at 1 execution, per month. And I think because we focus so much on availability and the customer experience, we try and have built a lot of tools over the time to make sure that no matter what kind of workload you're running on Lambda, you're getting the availability promise, and we're meeting our goals that we've set for ourselves in terms of what kind of failure rates we have and just what kind of latency customers are experiencing. So that kind of tooling and operational prowess is something that we've built up a lot over the last 10 years because workloads have grown on Lambda and have gotten very large, but still you have people that are playing around in the console running their first function, and they want we want that to be as successful as the millionth TPS for a large customer. And I think that going back to kind of like, well, actually Usman and I met when he was the head of autoscaling, and we were running on kind of the pre-Firecracker days. And I remember I met him when I took the bus up to Vancouver to have a nice discussion about scale of autoscaling. And he basically told me that like Lambda is just like a constantly running stress test against our systems, because the way that most people use autoscaling is they boot some instances, they maybe change and mutate things once a day, once a week, and we were just like constantly growing and scaling and detaching things and running EC2 instances. So the migration to Firecracker, I think, was definitely a big game changer for our ability to kind of innovate and keep things stable and scaling and allow us to grow, because we were that constant stress test for autoscaling, but at some point we could see the end of the runway, and like that approach and that architecture was just going to not carry us into the future. So we had to do a lot of innovation around virtualization and doing things like Firecracker.
So did Firecracker sort of come to a crunch? Because obviously before Firecracker, Lambda was running on EC2 instances, and there is a reInvent talk that myself and Chris Greenwood did, where you sort of explained how that was. I mean, that must have been crazy in a way to run, individual EC2 instances, even though they're represented as small kind of functions. So was this just a forcing function that, there's no way that we could run it at scale, and probably even, economically as well, let alone control plane, that must just been causing chaos for EC2. So was there sort of a tipping point where it was like, we got to build something like Firecracker, or was there something else that caused that to be created?
No, there was a tipping point, right? Like we were causing impact to AWS as a whole, right? Like we were really hammering autoscaling, we were hammering EC2, but it was a way for us to actually launch a product in 2014, because like as others were saying, right, like security is such a huge part of what we do. And so for us to kind of like launch a product out of the gate that we weren't sure, like, how, what is going to resonate with customers, what's not going to resonate with customers. So we just basically leveraged, well, we have the security kind of construct in an EC2 instance that we know how to operate. We know what it is. Yeah, we're using it in a little bit of a way that we probably shouldn't, but it allowed us to get out of the door and allowed us to kind of meet the security expectations that we needed to meet. And then once the product was successful and we kept growing and growing, then we kind of had to have a bit of a yay, we're being successful, and then we're being successful, we need to like fix this. So that's where Firecracker came from, and we worked with did a lot of really interesting work with folks, and basically did a migration of the system seamlessly over to Firecracker. And that's a lot of what kind of I drove and helped do within the team. And it was, we were able to accomplish it. It was a long journey, and a lot of people did a lot of really hard and good technical work, but we were able to kind of stop beating up EC2 and autoscaling.
It's always very impressive to me just how much effort goes into making these systems better behind the scenes, and we just very, very carefully make things compatible. We test in parallel. We introduce them gradually, and the service just gets better and better and more reliable and faster and more scalable and does more cool things. But we never say, okay, pause everything, stand by, come back tomorrow, we'll have it all put back together for you. We just gradually and seamlessly introduce coolness and newness. And I don't even know exactly how we do it, but it's always just super impressive to see that in action.
I think
it takes a lot of effort goes into, how do we do this smoothly? How do we do this in a way that, because people are running their businesses on Lambda, right? So there is no, we can't take the open sign and flip it to closed for a few hours while we, try to change this one thing. We have to do it, we have to like rebuild the plane while it's in the air is something that we say sometimes, because people's businesses just don't want to, they don't want to stop. It would be unreasonable and crazy for us to ask them to stop.
Yeah, sometimes you hear from a customer, they will say, hey, internally, we always know when we're deploying things, and we'd like to know when you're deploying things too. So can you just tell us every time you're deploying a change? Yes. And my response is, okay, right now, we're deploying a change right now. and now it's continuous.
Right.
And people, I think customers don't realize just the magic of that, of like the fact that we are actually continuously deploying, and that the service is constantly getting better, and that all of that is work you don't have to do.
Yeah. And I think that a big thing, Nick, there is that, to me, the intent behind the ask there from customers is they really don't like it when something changes out from under them and breaks them, right? So that's where a lot of work that we've done with like runtime compatibility and things like that, because, we're trying to always, move customers' workloads onto the latest and most secure versions of their runtimes. But things break, things change. And so giving folks that kind of flexibility and kind of heads up is definitely something that it's a balance that we definitely have to strike, and we discuss a lot internally about, what's the best way for us to like make this so that it's important and customers can do something about it when they need to, but also if it's also just magic if they don't have to think about it.
Yeah. Funny enough, just on a sort of slight change of tack, another technology came out 10 years ago as well. That's actually Kubernetes, who would have thought? And so we've got this sort of thing of Kubernetes and ECS and Lambda coming up. So Ramya, you're in charge of marketing these sort of two different kind of animals. How do people think about containers in terms of ECS and EKS, and even what is serverless in 2024 when we've got all these different kind of options?
Yeah, and what a tough job I have, Julian. No, I'm just kidding. No, this team partly makes my job easy. But when we think of Kubernetes and serverless, we actually think of those as two operating models. With serverless, you're interacting with the AWS API. You are building your entire software supply chain, if I may, on AWS in a way, and you leverage the integrations, the availability, the scale, the pieces that Usman, Ajay, Nick referred to as sort of your fundamentals in delivering your applications. Now with Kubernetes, customers want to use the Kubernetes operating model, want to use the Kubernetes API. They're looking at this open source piece, which perhaps gives them an element of portability and the sort of upstream supply chain in terms of the templates and the and the deployment pieces that are available with Kubernetes. So, in fact, interestingly, many of our top customers use both. And this is driven by, we've seen in terms of, skills of teams. The team is sort of proficient with Kubernetes. They adopt that. If they like using Lambda or ECS, they use that. We see it's driven by the ecosystem of tools that they use. And we see that it's driven by some specific requirements, whether it's a technology preference in the region they operate or in the industry they operate. So really, from as a company, we provide choices in all our segments, but especially when it comes to container orchestrators, we again give you choice. And the interesting piece is, customers seem adept at using both. And we always joke, and Nick and I always talk about this. If somebody uses Kubernetes, they already know they want Kubernetes. And with folks using serverless, that they want to get to market faster with a supply chain that's tied to AWS and the API. So that's how we see the evolution. Now, in terms of what serverless means in 2024, a lot of it has remained the same with what the fundamentals, the vision that we launched back in 2014 sort of remains the same. But we've also sort of evolved it with some of the great work that this team has been doing. So if you ask me, what does serverless mean in 2024? It's fundamentally four things. We spoke about abstracting complexity, and this is complexity of infrastructure management. Like, why are you doing things that are not adding value to your business when serverless can do that for you, when AWS can do that for you? The second piece is helping you write as less code as possible. How can you build systems which is composing applications together so you can just get to market quickly? The third is, are you building systems that are extensible and are able to integrate with diverse pieces easily? So I know today you're looking at your current requirements of customers and you're building pieces for that. But tomorrow when the requirements change, how easily are you able to adapt your system? And last but not the least, this was spoken about extensively, how are we driving fundamentals of availability, resilience, scale, security for you, and how we take on the heavy lifting of those pieces of operation. So I think those are the four sort of tenets. It's not changed much, but I think we are continuously evolving our technology and innovating to make sure that our customers are getting the best of AWS and getting to market quickly without compromising on the differentiated pieces that they want to deliver for their customers.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rami. And I think there's also definitely a bit of it's not either or solution. And even, there used to be all the containers versus serverless wars. Remember those? And it's funny to think, ECS and Lambda was, born at the same reInvent, but there was this containers and Lambda wars, which I don't know, I never quite understood. I mean, even internally, product-wise, Nick, you're the sort of boss of serverless compute, that is Lambda and serverless containers. We see them as part of the whole sort of kind of spectrum. So as these, merged customers use either or both, how do people think about sort of positioning that for their own architectures?
Well, I think, one thing I will say is that, especially when you look at larger customers, they're very likely to use all of the above. Even Kubernetes in the mix, you'll have customers that use Kubernetes, they use ECS, with serverless containers and Fargate, they use Lambda functions. And what you see is that the choice is often as much a choice about the expertise and interest of the team as it is about the characteristics of the workload. Because these things are all, to use a somewhat technical term, like they're Turing complete, like you can do anything with anything if you really want to. And so what you see is you see customers who, they may have a long expertise on containers, and their developers are familiar with containers, and they know how to develop and write applications that run well in a container. And so they're going to be very likely to say, let's run on containers. And if we've already got teams that know and love Kubernetes, we're going to use ECS. If we're container centric, we don't have teams that know Kubernetes. We don't want to take that on. You're going to use Fargate. When you have customers who are interested in having the most amount of things be managed by AWS, that's where you see customers much more likely to choose Lambda, right? Because as we already said, Lambda kind of takes care of as much as possible, not just the virtual machines the way that Fargate does, but even the operating system and the language runtime. And those customers then are handing over more responsibility to AWS and getting a lot more benefit in return of less and less things they have to manage. You know, we see at the workload level, a particularly good fit is with what we call event-driven architectures, where an event-driven architecture really means, you know, you've got like work to do. You know, maybe it's a file that has to be processed, or a submission that's made on a website, or some event, the thing that happens, and then there's a chain of things that you want to have follow after that. Lambda is just like really well suited, especially for those types of workloads. But you also see customers running, you know, web applications and scheduled jobs and all sorts of other things with Lambda as well. But I would say the really sweet spot that customers have centered on is that event-driven architecture type of application.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, I'm going to jump in real quick. As you know, this is serverless office hours, which means people ask us questions. We've got some questions coming in. Obviously, we have an amazing panel here, and Julian and I. And so we'd like to throw some questions in here. First question we have is actually a comment and then follow a question. This is by AJ. We all know AJ here. It says 10 years is such an accomplishment, as Julian mentioned earlier. It's commendable that Lambda and ECS haven't had to change too much in that time. Given the ever-changing customer demands and competitive landscape, how will Lambda and ECS need to change to meet developer needs over the next 10 years? Usman, I'll throw that at you for a moment if you're all right with that.
I'm okay with that. I think that's a wonderful question. And look, this is what I was hinting towards as well, is that we can't stop innovating in this space, right? Like we are a long way from baking armies and auto-scaling VMs at this point. And look, even this year, the last 18 months, we're seeing a whole new class of applications being built with generative AI. And when I look at some of the application patterns, we're still early. Like, look, that particular avenue is not fully baked yet. But even the early architectural patterns I see is there's a lot of asynchronous waiting or asynchronous requests when you interact with these LLMs. There's lots of challenges around back pressure or managing the capacity within the LLMs. That translates perfectly for serverless architectures, right? Like these architectures are so good when it comes to event-driven or asynchronous workloads that we're almost seeing a whole new class of ways customers are using Lambda or ECS today. And so figuring out how we evolve the product so that we can actually help customers do a lot more. For example, in these class of workloads is always going to be an interesting thing for the next if I look at the crystal ball for the next few years, few months. But also our existing workloads, right? Like we're not done innovating and making event-driven architectures or web workloads easier to build. There's always more to do. And I think our mission really still remains the fastest way to bring an idea into production. There's still a lot more to do, both in the inner developer loop as people are developing, writing, testing the code, all the way to the outer loop where they're getting their application production ready. There's still so much we can do to simplify, and I think that's how the products are going to continue to evolve for the next 10 years.
Excellent. Anybody else have something they want to add?
Well, Malcolm, I just want to jump in. Like you building serverless compute stuff, what is the sort of coolest thing on ECS that maybe you're working on behind the scenes, whether we can talk about it or not, or what's like, what are the cool toys in the sort of ECS Fargate world that excite you at the moment?
So I think it's kind of doubling down on a lot of what the team has been saying. You know, we're focusing very much on that initial mission statement. I thought it was really cool that you led with Werner on stage talking about like simplicity as our mission. You know, we want to remove that undifferentiated work. So the team is doing a lot of work and trying to work out how we take on more of that undifferentiated work. And so, you know, I can't see us changing that mission over the course of the next 10 years. Right now, we're doing a lot of work on a bunch of new innovations that we're excited to bring to customers in the near future, specifically around some of these things, taking on more of that management burden.
Cool, thanks. Time is good. We need another hour. We've got so much we can talk about. But what I did want to bring in is, there's always been a big community aspect about serverless, and really passionate, sort of a passionate group of people who've always been building as partly as our customers. Let's hear from some of them.
Our first experience on Lambda. So let me check.
Let me see. Just trying to think of, I built so many. I'm just trying to think of like what one would be really interesting.
Well, I think Farah wanted me to show my tattoo because I have a Lambda tattoo.
Let me try that one more time. Let's see here.
Oh, right.
When I discovered Lambda in 2015, the way that I saw how you would build apps with that completely changed the way I thought about building applications. I remember when Lambda first was launched, and it was kind of this thumbnailing service for S3. And then as time sort of went on, more and more people were like, well, this is really useful. Could we apply this to something new?
What really surprised me and was absolutely gratifying was how quickly bigger organizations and enterprises quickly took to Lambda and said, this is perfect for so many different kinds of applications that we're building, from stream-based processing and data processing to changing formats to building internal applications.
This allowed me to focus on things that matter to my customers and allow me to be far more productive.
I've worked at mostly on smaller teams. Lambda and ECS both have been really instrumental in us being able to keep our infrastructure part in infrastructure as code.
When I use AWS Lambda, we can keep our team smaller.
Lambda also helped us to have almost 100% of uptime, without having a dedicated ops team.
Lambda has been critical to most projects that I've been involved in. It allows you to run code without managing servers, without having to deal with the scaling to support your traffic both up and down, and remove so many tasks from your to-do list.
When you're working with Lambda functions for scalability perspective, it's been amazing. And since Lambda's cost is on per execution, it's very cost effective.
One of the biggest benefits of building anything on Lambda and serverless services at AWS is the fact that my team can move ridiculously fast.
Serverless is the actually key concept of and key technology that we are using to actually speed up the delivery cycles, speed up the delivery of business value, and help science actually move a lot faster than it was doing before serverless.
When you're working with a team on a real product that real people use and depend on, it's really great to have both the power of ECS and the power of Lambda to back us up.
The more I'm thinking about it, it's well, did I ever do anything without having a Lambda function?
I think, Lambda and ECS really offered, a simplified way for teams to take their ideas to market.
I can't resist sharing this segment from the blog post I wrote 10 years ago to launch Lambda. Lambda is a zero administration compute platform. You don't have to configure, launch, or monitor EC2 instances. You don't have to install any operating systems or language environments. You don't need to think about scale or fault tolerance, and you don't need to request or reserve capacity. A freshly created function is ready and able to handle tens of thousands of requests per hour with absolutely no incremental effort on your part and on a very cost-effective basis. Totally true a decade ago and still true today.
Happy birthday, Lambda and ECS. Happy birthday, you two kids. And here's to 10 more years of greatness.
Here's to many more years of taking undifferentiated heavy lifting off of customers.
Thanks for making me more productive for the last 10 years. I'm shocked Lambda's 10 now. I don't know where the time went. That happened so fast. Happy birthday, Lambda. I hope we get another 100 years of you.
Happy a decade, my old friend, Lambda Function.
So happy birthday to, yes, Lambda and also ECS. But I have to say thanks to Lambda for really changing my life, my career trajectory, and providing me with friends from all over the world, and for helping me to see so many people excelling and feeling like they're accomplishing more in less time.
Jeff, over to you. The community of ECS and Lambda over 10 years. How's the community evolved, and what have you seen when you've been out there talking to lots of people?
It's amazing to talk to the community because what they like about what we do is what it enables them to do. That they're super fans. They're so enthusiastic about this, but it isn't because it isn't about us. It's about how we've empowered them. And what they're saying is, AWS, you guys are awesome because you gave us these incredible tools and you've empowered us to go out and solve problems incredibly efficiently and easily and quickly. And it's actually like, it's enjoyable to use these services. Yes, there's the occasional frustration trying to figure something out, but by and large, it's actually like, wow, I need to process thousands or tens of thousands of somethings per hour that are coming in from S3. Okay, I'll write this little function. I could prototype the function literally on my phone and in JavaScript if I wanted to, and then put it into Lambda and say, okay, regardless of the scale of what's flowing in, I just know that Lambda is going to handle that without having to worry about it. And they get that, and they're literally so like thrilled by that idea and by 100 other cool things they can do that they can't help themselves but tell everybody. Like when you get so excited about some technology and like every random person you meet, you figure out some way to work this into your conversation. That's how you know someone's just excited by something that we've done for them.
Cool. Yeah, I love the community aspect as well. But we are running quickly out of time. But I also want to just ask Ajay, now that you've left, are there any things AWS or Lambda should have done differently? Because you can probably answer in a different way since you've left. Or if you cast back over 10 years, I mean, decisions are always about trade-offs. But what do you think should have been possibly a different path? Good or
no,
worse?
I'm free to say whatever, right? You have the mute button ready, so that's good. No, I think Julian actually in one of the first PR FAQs that was written for Lambda that talked about the Lambda 1.0 launch that was supposed to be a year or two out. One of the statements written in there was first-class Docker support. So the idea that if I could go back and turn time, I would have just avoided this entire container and functions flame war that just got set up. Like, it was never intended to be two separate things. In fact, Nick may or may not remember, there was a whole work stream where we talked about Lambda being running on top of ECS at one particular time. They were just different levels of abstraction that were intended to essentially serve the same purpose, take your code and run it. Whether you package it as a container or a zip file should not have mattered. And I feel like that to be fair, like, I think there was a big attempt at making the deployment model be a first-class thing, and I do think it's kind of found its place as a lightweight approach. The packaging is a zip and deploying, but whether it's and at some point we did pivot to say, you know what, let's embrace it. That's a deployment model that works for customers. We can add patching on top of it. I think the team's done a bunch of work to make that kind of innovation work on how you can provide patching while working the container native behavior work. I think that's the biggest change that I would say. I would also say, like, the and not or behavior carrying forward is going to be critical, right? Like, sitting outside, in my role as sort of GVP of Platform Elastic, I run serverless services built on top of Kubernetes across 3 cloud providers, right? So I'm the living embodiment of bringing those two concepts together and saying that you can put one to work to deliver a different value to customers as it runs over there. So I think it's going to be the same for AWS looking forward as well. Like, if you look at Kubernetes as an orchestration and deployment framework, great, make Lambda work with it, make ECS work with it. If containers works across ECS and Lambda, make it work for it. I think focusing on the place where the value remains unique and pushing forward is the way sort of AWS pushes and innovates there. If I had a wish list item, I would say put your GenAI tools to work for composing serverless services together to create applications. I think one of the serverless heroes had I had put together this voice-driven app at one point. I don't know if Eric, you will remember this. There was a voice AI one where you could tell Alexa, someone to say create an application, and it would just compose the application together by putting functions and step functions and others together. That is far more closer to reality now than you can do otherwise, right? So take the concepts that you have with Lambda and otherwise really can put together a real production no-code future using GenAI together. And I feel that's a very exciting opportunity that can put even more undifferentiated living out there. You've removed servers from the equation, now remove architectural design from the equation.
Excellent, Ajay. Thank you for being a good part of Lambda. We now have our marching orders going forward, so we appreciate that as well. I'm not going to put Eric on the spot to ask us to sing Happy to Lambda and ECS. I know he's dying, but we've unfortunately run out of time. So everybody, thanks so much for joining us, spending an hour with us, for your questions, your comments, and everything. To the next 10 years, happy birthday, ECS and Lambda. And we'll actually be demoing some more stuff about Lambda and possibly ECS next week on Serverless Office Hours. But for everybody, thanks so much for joining and sharing your amazing stories about some of our foundational services. Thank you.